Hi, I'm Richard Green. I'm director of the USC Lusk Centre for Real Estate at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles, and I'm also a senior visiting fellow at Brookings India. In my talk today, I covered a number of things, but I think one of the most important takeaways is that India is not building enough housing. If you look at the US, we're at a point right now where we're building very little, and we build about 6 houses per 1,000 people in the United States right now, and that's not enough to keep up with demand. India, of course, needs to build even more housing than the United States does, and it's building at about 4 houses per 1,000 people, at least in the 27 largest cities for which we have building data. So it's building at only 2/3 the pace of the United States, and of course has a lot of catching up to do with respect to housing. So I think that's one of the key points about thinking about how to get rid of frictions that are preventing more housing construction. Another key point is there's a lot of heterogeneity in India's housing markets. You could see that if you look at prices. They range from Delhi, which is a market where prices have been more or less flat with some volatility around that flatness going back for 6 or 7 years now, versus Hyderabad, where prices now are about 50% higher than they were only 6 years ago. And that probably reflects both the nature of the housing being built, the nature of the economic development, and also the infrastructure that was put in. And that gets it to the third key point, which is I think people wonder whether the big Indian cities are too big. And they are in the sense that they don't have adequate infrastructure to provide the services necessary for cities of their size. But if you ask, are they big relative to the optimal size of a big city, that's not necessarily the case. We could look at a place like Tokyo or a place like Seoul, which are bigger cities than any Indian cities at this point, although Delhi's catching up pretty quickly. And they're cities that function very well. And that's all about having the appropriate infrastructure. Because at the end of the day, the agglomeration benefits of bigness should create enough wealth that you can pay for the infrastructure to overcome the negative externalities arising from that bigness. Yeah, so I think we saw another really excellent presentation this morning that I think underscored one of the most important things that the government can do. And at the risk of sounding a little too libertarian, part of what it can do is get out of the way of development. But it still has an important part to play. And I think one of the most important things government can do is lay out cities well and then let the markets work around that layout. And so we saw an example of places that had very small lots available, which is basically the only way you can deliver very cheap housing. And you provide subsidies to these very small lots to allow poor people to live there, and then you allow people to buy larger lots at the market rate, and you cross-subsidize from those larger lots to the smaller lots. But at the end of the day, what the city has done, or what the government has done, is they've put in the infrastructure and they've sort of drawn the lines around the lots. They've drawn those lines in a very unrestrictive way and let people do what they will with that combination of infrastructure and subdivision. And I think if India moved to that model, you would see much more sustainable, much more affordable development in Indian cities. Yeah, so there's a paradox in India, which is that we know it doesn't have enough housing, as I said, but vacancy rates in its large cities run at about 10%. And to put that in some context, a normal vacancy rate in a housing market is more like 4 to 5%. And that arises from churning, so that's just natural. So why the 10%? I think there are 2 reasons. One is when developers build, they tend to build stuff that's too expensive given demand in the market. And the reason they do that is because it's very expensive to build in India, because it takes a long time to get stuff built in India, which means that when equity is put into a real estate development, it needs to get paid a lot of money. It needs to get paid for all that time that's not making money. And what that means is in order to get sufficient rent, in order to justify the investment, you have to charge a very high rent. The problem is that incomes in India are not high enough for people to pay those high rents. So then the next natural question is, okay, so why don't developers just cut their rents, take their losses, but minimize? And I think a lot has to do with the nature of tenant-landlord law in India, the most important issue being the ability to evict. And so if you're a landlord and someone ceases to pay the rent, in most markets around the world, you have the right to evict the tenant quickly. In India, you also have the right to evict a tenant, but you have to go through a judicial process in order to do that. That judicial process can last a very long time. And as a result of that, you can have a tenant in place not paying rent for a long period of time, basically adding to the depreciation of housing, because when people live in a house, they do beat it up a little bit, even the best tenants do. And so when you have the alternative between, okay, I could have a tenant who may wind up not paying rent, and then I'm stuck with them for a while, or just not letting out the place at all, I may just decide to leave the place vacant. And I think that explains a lot of what's going on here in India.